Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a time when asking someone to marry you was not just a question, it was a carefully orchestrated performance with unwritten rules, social expectations, and more nervous energy than a high school dance. We're talking about 1950s America, when a man preparing to propose did not just buy a ring and hope for the best. He sought permission, demonstrated stability, proved his character, and followed a protocol so specific it might as well have been printed in the Sunday newspaper, alongside advice columns and cake recipes. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. And thank you for suggesting this topic. I always appreciate hearing what you want to explore next. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I know someone out there is listening at 11:30 at night, eating crackers in bed, pretending this counts as productive relaxation. And if you prefer audio, we're now live on Spotify, link is in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise breeze, wiggle down under your blanket and get comfortable. Really comfortable. Like you're settling in for the long haul and nothing short of an emergency is going to move you. Because tonight we're exploring a world where marriage was not just a personal milestone, it was a social contract witnessed by families, neighborhoods, and sometimes the entire town. A world where a young man saved for months to buy a modest ring, rehearsed his speech until his roommate begged him to stop, and dressed in his best suit just to ask a father for permission to court his daughter seriously. Have you ever wondered what it really felt like to prepare for that moment? How many hours did men spend agonizing over the right words? Did fathers actually turn down hopeful suitors at the door? Or was that just something people worried about? What was it like sitting across from your girlfriend's father, palms sweating, voice cracking slightly, knowing your entire future hinged on his approval? And how did women feel, waiting to see if the man they loved would meet every single expectation their families held? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1953. You're a young man in your mid-20s, gainfully employed, reasonably respectable, and deeply, nervously in love. The ring is hidden in your sock drawer. Your courage is somewhere between hopeful and terrified. And the rules, oh the rules, are about to guide every single step you take. Let's start with the foundation, the bedrock requirement that came before anything else. In 1950s America, a man did not even consider proposing unless he had steady work. Not just any work, but the kind of employment that proved he could provide for a family, keep a roof overhead, and maintain the dignity expected of a married man. This was not about wealth or status, it was about stability, about demonstrating that you were capable of shouldering the responsibilities that came with a wife and eventually children. Fathers asked about your job before they asked about your intentions. Mothers quietly assessed whether their daughter would be comfortable, not extravagant, but secure. And the community watched, because in small towns and tight-knit neighborhoods, everyone knew who had work and who was still figuring things out. You felt this pressure long before you ever thought about buying a ring. You felt it every time you passed her father on the street and exchanged polite greetings, both of you knowing what was unspoken between you. You felt it when her mother invited you to Sunday dinner and asked, almost casually, how things were going at the factory, the office, the shop. These were not idle questions. They were quiet assessments, gentle probes to determine whether you had what it took to be a husband. Employment meant more than a paycheck. It meant showing up on time, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. It meant keeping your head down, doing the work, earning the respect of your supervisor and your co-workers. It meant building a reputation as someone reliable, someone who did not call in sick without good reason, someone who could be counted on when the job got difficult. Your work defined you in ways that are harder to understand now, when careers shift and change and people move between jobs like travellers between train stations. Back then, a man often stayed with the same company for years, decades even. building seniority and proving his worth through sheer consistency. The question fathers asked most often was simple but loaded. What do you do? And your answer had to be solid, specific, confident. You worked at the plant. You had a position with a telephone company. You were learning a trade, plumbing or electrical work, something with a future. You did not mumble or hedge or suggest you were still figuring things out. You looked him in the eye and told him exactly how you earned your living, because that answer would determine whether the conversation continued or ended right there at the front door. Some men work 2 jobs to prove themselves, taking evening shifts or weekend hours to build up savings faster, to show they were willing to sacrifice for the woman they loved. Others took on overtime, staying late at the factory or the warehouse, their hands rough and their backs aching, but their wallets a little heavier each week. The work was hard, often repetitive, sometimes dangerous, but it was honest, and that honesty mattered more than anything. And when you finally sat across from her father, when the conversation turned serious and he leaned back in his chair and asked you directly whether you could support his daughter, you did not hesitate. You told him yes. You told him about your salary, your benefits, your plans for the future. You showed him you had thought this through, that you were not some lovesick boy with empty pockets and big dreams. You were a man with a job, a plan, and the determination to see it through. Because without work there was no proposal. Without stability there was no marriage. It was as simple and as absolute as that. The ring was not just a piece of jewellery. It was a statement, a symbol, a tangible demonstration that you had planned for this moment and made sacrifices to reach it. In the 1950s, engagement rings were modest by today's standards, but that did not make them any less significant. A young man saved for months, sometimes a year or more, setting aside a portion of every paycheck until he had enough to walk into the jeweller and choose something meaningful. The ring was not about showing off. It was about showing you had thought ahead, that you valued her, that you were willing to go without to give her something that would sit on her finger for the rest of her life. Saving for the ring required discipline. You opened a small account at the bank, the kind with a passbook that the teller stamped each time you made a deposit. Every Friday after you cashed your paycheck, you set aside $5, $10 if you could manage it, and walked it straight to the bank before you could be tempted to spend it on anything else. The amount was not large by itself, but week after week it added up, slowly, steadily, until the balance began to look like something real. You made sacrifices. You skipped nights out with friends, turning down invitations to the bowling alley or the corner bar, offering vague excuses that everyone understood without you having to explain. You brought your lunch to work in a tin pail instead of buying sandwiches from the deli. You wore your shoes a little longer, resoled them one more time instead of buying a new pair. You did not complain. You did not resent it. This was what men did when they were serious about marriage. The day you finally had enough saved, you felt a quiet surge of pride, mixed with nervous anticipation. You put on your good shirt, combed your hair, and walked into the jewellery store on Main Street, the one with the velvet displays in the window and the soft lighting that made everything shimmer. The jeweller greeted you warmly, recognizing the look on your face, the look of a young man about to make the most important purchase of his life. He brought out trays of rings, each one nestled in its own small slot, and you studied them carefully, turning them under the light, imagining how they would look on her hand. Some had single diamonds, small but bright, catching the light with every movement. Others had clusters of smaller stones, or coloured gemstones, sapphires or emeralds, set in gold or silver bands. The jeweller explained the differences, the cuts, the clarity, the settings, but what mattered most to you was whether it felt right, whether it seemed like something she would wear with pride. You chose carefully, not the most expensive, but not the cheapest either. Something in the middle, something that reflected the effort you had put in without exceeding what you could afford. The jeweller sized it, polished it, and placed it in a small velvet box that snapped shut with a satisfying click. You paid in cash, counting out the bills you had saved over so many months, and the jeweller shook your hand and wished you luck. Walking out of that store with the box in your pocket, you felt the weight of it, small but significant. A physical reminder that you were ready. You had saved. You had planned. You had made the sacrifice. And now, the ring was waiting for the moment when you would kneel, open that box and ask the question that would change both of your lives forever. This was the moment every young man dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. Before you could ask the woman you loved to marry you, you had to face her father, sit across from him in his living room or at his kitchen table and ask for his blessing. This was not a formality. It was a test, a quiet interrogation disguised as a conversation, where every word mattered and every hesitation was noted. Fathers wanted to know if you were serious, if you could provide, if you would treat their daughter with the respect and care she deserved. Some fathers were warm and welcoming, shaking your hand and offering congratulations before you even finished your nervous speech. Others were more reserved, studying you carefully, asking pointed questions about your job, your plans, your character. You prepared for this conversation like you were preparing for a job interview, because in a way, that was exactly what it was. You rehearsed what you would say, standing in front of your bathroom mirror, trying out different phrasings, different tones, searching for the words that would convey both confidence and humility. You wanted to sound respectful but not weak, determined but not arrogant. It was a delicate balance, and you knew you would only get one chance to get it right. The day arrived and you dressed carefully, wearing your best suit, the one you reserved for church and special occasions. You polished your shoes until they gleamed. You combed your hair, checked your teeth, made sure there was nothing about your appearance that might suggest you were anything less than serious. You drove to her house, your stomach tight with nerves, your hands gripping the steering wheel a little too hard. Her father answered the door. He looked at you, nodded, and stepped aside to let you in. The house smelled like coffee and something baking, warm and familiar, but the warmth did nothing to settle your nerves. He led you into the living room, gestured to a chair, and sat down across from you. For a moment neither of you spoke. He waited. You cleared your throat. You began slowly, carefully. You told him how much his daughter meant to you, how she had changed your life, how you could not imagine a future without her. You told him about your job, your savings, your plans for the future. You told him you would work hard to provide for her, to give her a good life, to honour her the way she deserved. You asked, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through you, for his permission to marry her. He did not answer right away. He studied you, his expression unreadable, and for a moment you wondered if you had said something wrong, if you'd failed some invisible test. Then he leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and began to ask questions. What were your intentions? How would you support her? Where would you live? Did you understand what marriage required? The sacrifices, the compromises, the commitment? You answered each question honestly, meeting his gaze, refusing to look away. You did not try to embellish or exaggerate. You simply told him the truth, that you loved his daughter, that you would do everything in your power to make her happy, that you understood the weight of what you were asking finally after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. He nodded. He stood, extended his hand, and shook yours firmly. You have my blessing, he said. And just like that, the hardest part was over. You had faced the gatekeeper and passed through. Now all that remained was asking her. Character was everything. It was the invisible currency that determined whether families accepted you, whether neighbours respected you, whether your proposal would be received with joy or hesitation. A man's character was measured not by grand gestures but by consistency, by how he treated waitresses and shopkeepers, by whether he showed up on time, paid his debts, kept his word. Fathers asked around. They spoke to employers, to neighbours, to anyone who might know you. They wanted to hear that you were dependable, honest, hard-working, the kind of man who would honour his commitments and care for their daughter even when times got hard. Your character was built slowly over years through small decisions that no one paid much attention to at the time, but that accumulated into a reputation. It was built every time you returned a borrowed tool, every time you held a door for someone carrying groceries, every time you stopped to help a neighbour fix a flat tyre or shovel snow from an elderly widow's driveway. These were not calculated acts designed to impress. They were simply the things a decent man did and people noticed. In small towns especially, everyone knew everyone, and reputations travelled fast. If you cut corners at work, people heard about it. If you drank too much at the tavern and caused a scene, word got back to your family and hers. If you borrowed money and failed to repay it, the story spread until it became part of how people thought of you. Your character was public property in a way that feels almost invasive now, when privacy is prized and people can reinvent themselves by moving to a new city. Back then, you could not outrun your reputation. You had to live with it, and if it was poor, you had to work twice as hard to rebuild it. Fathers were especially vigilant about character because they understood that marriage was not just about love. It was about partnership, about trust, about facing life's hardships together. They wanted to know that when things got difficult, when money was tight or illness struck or disagreements arose, you would not run. You would not drink yourself into oblivion or disappear or lash out in anger. You would stand firm, handle your responsibilities, and treat their daughter with the kindness and respect she deserved. Your character was tested in how you courted her. Did you arrive on time for dates, or did you leave her waiting? Did you open doors, help her with her coat, walk her safely to her door? Did you speak respectfully about her in front of your friends, or did you make crude jokes and boast about things that should remain private? Did you listen when she spoke, or did you dominate every conversation? These details mattered because they revealed who you were when no one was grading you, when you thought no one important was watching. Employers were often contacted discreetly by fathers who wanted to know whether you were reliable. Does he show up on time? Does he do good work? Does he get along with others? Can he be trusted with responsibility? These were not invasions of privacy. They were due diligence, the careful research a father conducted to ensure his daughter's future was in capable hands. And when the time came to ask for her hand, your character either spoke for you or against you. If you had built a solid reputation, the conversation was easier, the blessing more readily given. If your character was questionable, no amount of charm or promises could overcome the doubt, because a father's job was to protect his daughter, and he took that job seriously. He would not hand her over to a man he could not trust, no matter how much she claimed to love him. Character was not something you could fake or rush. It was the sum total of who you were day after day, year after year. And when you finally stood before her father and asked for permission to marry, your character was the only resume that mattered. Courtship in the 1950s was a slow, deliberate process governed by rules everyone understood but rarely spoke aloud. You did not rush. You did not assume. You asked permission to call on her, arranged dates in public places, brought her home before curfew, and treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Proper courtship meant opening doors, paying for meals, meeting her family, attending church together if her family attended. It meant showing, through your actions, that you were serious about her, that this was not a casual fling but the beginning of something permanent. The courtship began with a simple question, usually posed to her father, sometimes to her mother, occasionally to her directly if the family was more modern. "May I call on your daughter?" It was a formal request, spoken politely, and it required a clear answer. If the answer was yes, you were granted the privilege of visiting her at home, sitting with her in the living room under the watchful eyes of her parents, making polite conversation while her younger siblings giggled from the hallway. If the answer was no, you accepted it gracefully and moved on, because pushing back would only damage your reputation and hers. Once permission was granted, the courtship unfolded in stages. Early dates were always in public, places where you could talk but where propriety was maintained. You took her to the movies, sitting in the back row but keeping a respectful distance between you. You went to the soda fountain, sharing a milkshake with 2 straws, her laughter bright and easy as you talked about everything and nothing. You walked through the park on Sunday afternoons, your hand lightly touching her elbow as you navigated the path, her dress swishing softly against her legs. Every date had a curfew, a firm time by which she needed to be home, and you honoured it without fail. If her father said 10 o'clock, you had her back at 9:50, standing on the porch, thanking her for the evening, wishing her good night. You did not linger. You did not try to steal a few more minutes. You respected the boundary because respecting boundaries was what respectable men did. Physical affection was limited and carefully calibrated. You held her hand, but only after several dates, and only when it felt natural, not forced. You might put your arm around her shoulders at the movies, but you did not pull her close or let your hand wander. Kissing came later, often weeks or months into the courtship, and even then it was brief, chaste, the kind of kiss that left both of you blushing and smiling, but never crossing the line into impropriety. You met her family often, perhaps more often than you met with her alone. You attended Sunday dinners, sitting at the table, with her parents, her siblings, her grandparents if they lived nearby. You answered questions about your work, your family, your plans for the future. You complimented her mother's cooking, helped clear the table, offered to assist her father with small tasks around the house, fixing a squeaky hinge or carrying something heavy from the garage. These were not calculated moves designed to win favour. They were simply the right things to do, the behaviours expected of a man who wanted to become part of the family. You attended church with her if her family attended, sitting beside her in the pew, singing hymns from the shared hymnal, bowing your head during prayers. This was not about performing faith you did not feel. It was about showing respect for what mattered to her and her family, about demonstrating that you could fit into their world without friction or resistance. The courtship period was long, sometimes stretching for a year or more, because both families needed time to assess whether this relationship was built to last. Infatuation faded. True compatibility revealed itself slowly, through shared experiences, through disagreements handled with grace, through the steady accumulation of trust. Proper courtship was not romantic in the breathless, cinematic sense. It was careful, intentional, and deeply respectful, a foundation strong enough to support the weight of marriage. Meeting the family was not optional. It was a required step, a formal introduction that signalled your intentions were honourable and your interests serious. You showed up on a Sunday afternoon, dressed in your best clothes, carrying flowers or a small gift for her mother. You shook hands with her father, made polite conversation with her siblings, and endured the quiet scrutiny of aunts, uncles, and grandparents who had gathered to assess whether you were worthy of their beloved daughter, niece, granddaughter. Every family had its own customs, its own expectations, but the underlying message was always the same. If you wanted to marry this woman, you had to be accepted by the people who loved her first. The invitation usually came from her mother, delivered casually but weighted with significance. "Why don't you come for Sunday dinner?" It sounded simple, friendly even, but you understood what it meant. This was your audition, your chance to prove you belonged at their table, in their home, eventually in their family. You accepted with gratitude and a touch of nerves, knowing that everything you said and did during that meal would be remembered and discussed long after you left. You arrived early, not too early, but early enough to show you respected their time and their hospitality. You parked on the street, not in the driveway, leaving that space for family. You walked to the front door, flowers in hand, and knocked, your heart beating a little faster than usual. Her father answered, shook your hand with a firm grip, and welcomed you inside. The house smelled like roasting meat and fresh bread, warm and inviting, but the warmth did nothing to calm your nerves. Her mother appeared, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile genuine but assessing. You handed her the flowers, and she accepted them graciously, disappearing into the kitchen to find a vase. Her siblings watched from doorways and stairwells, curious, whispering to each other, sizing you up. You were polite to all of them, learning their names, asking them questions, showing interest in their lives, their hobbies, their schoolwork. Dinner was the main event. You sat where you were told to sit, usually across from her father, where he could observe you clearly. Grace was said, and you bowed your head, hands folded, even if you were not particularly religious. The food was passed around the table, and you took modest portions, waiting to see how much others took before serving yourself. You complimented the meal sincerely because it was delicious and because it mattered to her mother, that her efforts were appreciated. The conversation flowed, guided mostly by her father, who asked questions designed to reveal your character. Where did you grow up? What kind of work did your father do? What were your plans for the future? You answered honestly, carefully, aware that every word was being weighed. You did not dominate the conversation. You did not interrupt. You listened when others spoke, laughed at jokes even when they were not particularly funny, and offered your own stories only when invited. Her siblings tested you in their own ways. The younger ones asked blunt questions that made everyone laugh. The older ones, especially her brothers if she had them, watched with protective skepticism, ready to find fault if you gave them reason. You handled it all with good humour and patience, understanding that this was part of the process, that you had to win over not just her parents but everyone who cared about her. After dinner you offered to help clear the table. Her mother protested, but you insisted, carrying plates to the kitchen, scraping scraps into the bin, proving you were not above domestic work, that you understood marriage was a partnership. Her father invited you to sit on the porch afterward, and you accepted, knowing this was where the real conversation would happen, away from the rest of the family man to man. You left that evening with a handshake, a thank you, and the quiet sense that you had passed the first major test. They had met you, observed you, and found you acceptable, at least for now. The scrutiny would continue, of course. Every visit would be another evaluation, another opportunity to prove yourself. But you had made it through the door, and that was the first and most important step. Financial stability was not the same as wealth. It meant you could pay your bills, keep food on the table, and handle emergencies without falling apart. Fathers wanted to see a savings account, even a modest one. They wanted to know you had a plan, that you were not living paycheck to paycheck with no thought for the future. Some men brought bank statements to the conversation, not because anyone asked, but because it eased the unspoken concern hanging in the room. Could this young man provide? Could he be trusted with the financial security of a household? Could he weather the storms that inevitably came? You prepared for this conversation by organizing your finances, laying out the facts in a way that demonstrated responsibility without sounding boastful. You knew your monthly salary to the dollar. You knew how much you had saved, how much you spent on rent, how much you set aside for emergencies. You had a budget, even if you did not call it that. a mental ledger that tracked where every dollar went and ensured you were living within your means. Some fathers asked directly, "How much do you make?" It was not considered rude in an era when financial privacy was less sacred than it is now. You answered honestly, stating your weekly or monthly earnings, explaining any bonuses or overtime that supplemented your base pay. You did not inflate the numbers. You did not hedge. You simply told him what you earned and let him decide whether it was enough. Other fathers approached the question more subtly, asking about your living situation, your plans for housing, your ability to save. These indirect inquiries were easier to navigate but required the same level of honesty. You told him where you lived, whether you rented or boarded, what you paid each month. You explained how much you had saved toward a down payment on a house or toward furnishing an apartment. You showed him, through specifics, that you had thought this through, that you were not proposing marriage on a whim or a prayer. If you had debts, you disclosed them. A car loan, perhaps, or money borrowed from family to help cover an emergency. Fathers respected honesty, even when the news was not ideal. What they could not tolerate was deception, the discovery after the wedding that you were drowning in debt or living beyond your means. Transparency built trust, and trust was the currency that mattered most. You also discussed your plans for the future. How did you intend to increase your income? Were you pursuing promotions, learning new skills, taking on additional responsibilities at work? Did you have a 5-year plan, a vision for where you wanted to be financially when children arrived and expenses multiplied? These were not idle questions. They revealed whether you were a man who thought ahead or one who simply reacted to whatever life threw at him. Some men brought their bank passbook to the meeting, a small ledger stamped with each deposit showing months or years of disciplined saving. They opened it on the table, not aggressively but with quiet pride, and let the numbers speak for themselves. Others brought letters from their employers, references attesting to their reliability, their work ethic, their potential for advancement. These documents were not required, but they helped, tangible proof that you were serious, stable, and trustworthy. The conversation about money was never comfortable, but it was necessary. Marriage was not just a romantic union. It was an economic partnership, a household that required management, planning, and the ability to weather financial hardship without collapsing. A father needed to know that his daughter would not go hungry, that she would have a roof over her head, that she would not be abandoned when money got tight. He needed to know that you were a man who could provide not lavishly but consistently, reliably, year after year. And when the conversation ended, when he nodded and said he believed you were ready, you felt a quiet surge of relief. You had proven yourself financially, demonstrated that you were not just a dreamer but a planner, not just a romantic but a realist. You were ready to take on the responsibilities of marriage, and he trusted you to do so. Age mattered, not in a rigid mathematical sense, but in the understanding that a man should be old enough to have established himself before taking on the responsibilities of marriage. Most men married in their mid to late 20s, after they had finished their education, found steady work and saved enough to start a life. Marrying too young raised concerns. Would he be mature enough? Could he handle the pressures? Had he experienced enough of life to know what he was committing to? Fathers were especially wary of young men who seemed eager but unprepared, who had more enthusiasm than experience. The ideal age was somewhere between 24 and 28, old enough to have proven yourself in the workplace, young enough to start a family and raise children while you still had your health and energy. If you were younger than that, you faced skepticism. Are you sure you are ready? Have you thought this through? These questions were not meant to discourage you, but to ensure you understood the gravity of what you were proposing. If you were in your early 20s, barely out of school, just starting your career, fathers worried that you had not yet developed the maturity marriage required. They remembered their own early 20s, the mistakes they made, the lessons they learned the hard way, and they did not want their daughters caught in the turbulence of a young man still figuring out who he was. They wanted to see evidence of growth, of responsibility, of the kind of steady adulthood that came not from age alone but from experience. You proved your readiness not by arguing, but by demonstrating. You showed up consistently, week after week, proving you were not impulsive or flighty. You maintained your job, advanced in your career, built savings. You handled setbacks, disappointments at work, conflicts with friends, minor crises, with grace and maturity. You showed them that despite your youth, you had the temperament and the discipline to be a good husband. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were older, past 30, different questions arose. Why had you waited so long? Was there something in your past, a failed engagement, a reputation problem, a personal flaw that had kept you single? Older bachelors were viewed with mild suspicion, not because being single was shameful, but because marriage was considered the natural progression of adulthood, and delaying it suggested something was amiss. You addressed these concerns directly. Perhaps you'd been focused on your career, building a business, caring for aging parents. Perhaps you had not met the right person until now. Whatever the reason, you explained it honestly, without defensiveness, helping her family understand that your delay was not a red flag, but simply the result of circumstance or choice. Age also mattered in terms of the age gap between you and your bride. A few years' difference was expected, even preferred, with men typically being slightly older. But if the gap was too large, more than 10 years, eyebrows raised. Fathers worried about power imbalances, about whether a much older man was seeking a wife or someone he could control. They worried about life stages, about a young woman tied to a man who might age out of vitality while she was still in her prime. You navigated these concerns by showing respect for her autonomy, by treating her as a partner rather than a subordinate, by making it clear that your intentions were rooted in love and compatibility, not in some need to dominate or possess. You let your actions speak, proving through your courtship that the age difference did not diminish her voice or her agency. Ultimately, age was less about the number and more about what the number represented. Were you mature? Were you established? Had you grown into the kind of man who could handle the responsibilities of marriage? If the answer was yes, if you could demonstrate it through your actions and your character, then fathers gave their blessing, confident that their daughter was marrying not a boy playing house, but a man ready to build a life. Faith was woven into the fabric of 1950s life, and a man who wanted to marry into a family was expected to respect, if not share, their religious beliefs. If her family attended church every Sunday, you attended with them. If grace was said before meals, you bowed your head. If her parents valued certain traditions, baptisms, confirmations, holiday observances, you participated without complaint. This was not about forcing belief. It was about showing respect, about honouring the values that shaped the woman you loved and the family that raised her. Religion was not a private matter in the way it often is today. It was communal, visible, a defining feature of family identity. Families attended the same church for generations, sat in the same pew every Sunday, knew the pastor by name and were known by him. The church was where they celebrated births, mourned deaths, marked the milestones of life. It was central to who they were, and if you wanted to join their family, you had to make room for that centrality in your own life. If you shared their faith, the path was straightforward. You attended services together, participated in church activities, perhaps even joined the same congregation if you lived nearby. Your shared beliefs became a foundation for your marriage, a common language for navigating moral questions, raising children, finding comfort in difficult times. Fathers appreciated this alignment, saw it as a source of stability, a bond that would help you weather the challenges ahead. If you did not share their faith, the path was more complicated but not impossible. You attended anyway, not to deceive them into thinking you believed what you did not, but to show respect for what mattered to them. You listened to the sermons, sang the hymns even if the words felt foreign, bowed your head during prayers. You participated not as a believer but as a respectful guest, someone who understood that faith was important to the people you were about to call family. You did not argue theology. You did not criticize their beliefs or suggest they were backward or misguided. You kept your doubts and questions to yourself, or you discussed them privately with your future wife, in quiet conversations where honesty was possible without causing offense. You understood that respect did not require agreement, only acknowledgement that their faith shaped their lives in meaningful ways. Some families required more than attendance. They wanted assurance that you would raise your children in the faith, that you would not pull their daughter away from the tradition she had grown up with. This was a serious conversation, one that required honesty and careful negotiation. You discussed it with your future wife first, coming to an agreement about how you would handle religion in your marriage, in your home, with your children. Then you presented that agreement to her parents, showing them you had thought it through, that you were not dismissing their concerns but addressing them thoughtfully. If there were differences, Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Jewish, the challenges multiplied. Interfaith marriages were rare and often discouraged, seen as sources of future conflict and confusion. Fathers worried about divided households, about children caught between competing belief systems, about their daughter being isolated from her faith community. You addressed these worries head-on, explaining how you and your future wife planned to navigate those differences, how you would support each other's practices, how you would find common ground. You also respected the rituals. If her family observed Lent, you did not flaunt your lack of participation by eating meat on Fridays in their presence. If they celebrated religious holidays with specific customs, you joined in learning the traditions, asking questions when you didn't understand. You showed, through your willingness to participate, that you valued their heritage, their identity, the faith that had sustained them through hardship and joy. Respect for faith was ultimately about humility, about recognizing that your way was not the only way, that the beliefs that mattered to her family deserved honor even if you did not hold them yourself. It was about making space in your life for what they held sacred, proving that you could be part of their family without demanding they change to accommodate you. Where would you live? This was one of the first practical questions a father asked, and it required a concrete answer. A man did not propose without knowing where he would take his bride after the wedding. Some couples moved into modest apartments, small but clean, with enough room for two and the promise of more space later. Others saved for a down payment on a house, a starter home in a neighborhood where young families were beginning to put down roots. A few moved in with parents temporarily, though this was seen as less than ideal, a stopgap measure that required careful negotiation and clear timelines. You thought about housing long before you thought about proposing, because where you lived determined the quality of life you could offer. You drove through neighborhoods, noting the condition of the houses, the presence of children playing on sidewalks, the proximity to schools and churches and shopping. You imagined walking those streets with your wife, pushing a stroller, greeting neighbors, building a life. You narrowed your options based on what you could afford and what felt right. A place where she would feel safe, comfortable, proud to call home. If you planned to rent, you visited apartments, climbing narrow staircases to look at small units with compact kitchens and shared laundry facilities. You checked the plumbing, tested the windows, asked about heat in the winter. You calculated rent against your salary, making sure you could afford it comfortably, with enough left over for groceries, utilities, savings. You did not want to stretch yourself too thin to put financial pressure on the marriage before it even began. If you planned to buy, the process was longer and more complex. You saved for a down payment, setting aside money month after month until you had enough to approach a bank. You met with a loan officer, filled out paperwork, provided proof of employment and income. You sat nervously while they reviewed your application, hoping your credit was solid, your savings sufficient. When the loan was approved, you felt a surge of pride, tangible proof that you were ready to own property, to take on the responsibilities of a mortgage, to provide a permanent home. You searched for houses, attending open houses on Sunday afternoons, walking through empty rooms, imagining furniture, imagining her in the kitchen, imagining children running down the hallway. You look for good bones, solid construction, a layout that made sense. You check the roof, the foundation, the electrical wiring. You talk to neighbours, asking about the area, about schools, about whether this was a place where people stayed or just passed through. When you found the right place, you made an offer, negotiated the price, signed the papers. You held the keys in your hand, metal warm from your grip, and felt the weight of what you had just done. This was yours. This was where you would begin your life together. This was the foundation on which everything else would be built. If moving in with parents was the only option, you approached it carefully, discussing boundaries and expectations. How long would you stay? What would you contribute financially? How would you maintain independence while living under someone else's roof? These were difficult conversations, but necessary ones, ensuring that everyone understood the arrangement and that it would not become a source of resentment. You presented your housing plan to her father with confidence, laying out the details, showing him you had thought this through. You told him where you would live, how much it would cost, how you would furnish it, how you would make it a home. You showed him you were not asking his daughter to step into uncertainty, but into a life you had carefully prepared for her. Because a house was more than walls and a roof. It was security, it was stability, it was the place where a marriage began and a family grew. And a man who could provide that, who could offer his bride a home, proved he was ready for everything that came next. Scandal was the enemy of a good reputation, and a good reputation was everything. A man who wanted to marry had to keep his record clean, no run-ins with the law, no whispers of impropriety, no behaviour that might embarrass her family or cast doubt on his character. Fathers asked around. They listened to gossip, not because they were nosy, but because they needed to know if you were the kind of man who could be trusted. A single misstep, a drunken argument at a bar, an unpaid debt, a rumour about another woman, could derail a proposal before it ever happened. You lived carefully, aware that eyes were always watching, that your actions in public would be reported, discussed, analysed. Small towns especially were unforgiving. Everyone knew everyone, and news travelled faster than reason. If you stayed out too late on a Saturday night, someone's mother mentioned it to someone's aunt who mentioned it to her family over Sunday dinner. If you were seen arguing with a co-worker, the story grew with each retelling until you were branded as hot-tempered or difficult. If you spent too much time at the tavern, even if you were only drinking soda and playing cards, people assumed the worst. You avoided situations that could be misinterpreted. You did not linger alone with other women, even in innocent circumstances, because innocent circumstances could be twisted into something scandalous by a single misplaced observation. You did not borrow money without a clear plan to repay it, because unpaid debts became stories, and stories became judgments about your character. You kept your finances in order, your temper in check, your social life modest and above reproach. If you made a mistake, if you lost your temper once and said something you regretted, if you had too much to drink at a friend's wedding and made a fool of yourself, you worked quickly to repair the damage. You apologized sincerely, not just to the person you offended, but to anyone who witnessed it. You acknowledged your error publicly, humbly, showing that you understood the gravity of your lapse and were committed to doing better. Redemption was possible, but it required effort, consistency, time. Some men carried baggage from their past, youthful indiscretions that haunted them years later, a fight that got out of hand, a relationship that ended badly, a brief period of unemployment that spawned rumours about laziness or instability. These shadows followed you, whispered about whenever your name came up, and you had to work harder than others to prove yourself. You could not erase the past, but you could show, through your present behaviour, that you had changed, matured, learned from your mistakes. Fathers were especially vigilant about scandal because they understood that their daughter's reputation was tied to yours. If you were involved in something shameful, the shame would extend to her family, to everyone connected to you. They would not risk it. They would not allow their daughter to marry a man whose name carried even a hint of dishonour, no matter how much she claimed to love him. You protected your reputation fiercely, understanding that it was fragile, easily damaged, difficult to rebuild. You avoided gossip, refused to participate in conversations that tore others down, because engaging in gossip meant you complicit made you part of the problem. You kept your private life private, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for boundaries, for the understanding that some things were not meant to be shared with the world. When the time came to ask for her hand, your clean record spoke for you. Fathers made calls, asked questions, listened carefully. They heard that you were dependable, respectful, honest. They heard that you treated people well, paid your bills, stayed out of trouble. They heard nothing that gave them pause, nothing that made them doubt you. And that absence of scandal, that clean slate, was one of your greatest assets, proof that you were a man who could be trusted with their most precious treasure. Drinking was common in the 1950s, but drunkenness was not tolerated, especially not in a man preparing to marry. A father wanted to know you could handle your liquor, that you would not embarrass yourself or your future wife at social gatherings, that you would not spend the family budget at the local tavern. Responsibility extended beyond alcohol. It meant showing up when you said you would, keeping your promises, managing your time and money wisely. It meant being the kind of man who could be counted on, not just in the good times, but when things got difficult. You drank, perhaps, but moderately. A beer with dinner, a whiskey at a wedding reception, a cocktail at a company party. You knew your limits and respected them, understanding that losing control even once could cost you everything. You watched other men stumble out of bars, their speech slurred, their judgment impaired, and you felt a mixture of pity and determination. That would never be you. You would never give anyone reason to question your sobriety or your sense. Fathers paid close attention to how you handled alcohol because it revealed deeper truths about your character. A man who drank to excess was a man who could not control himself, who prioritized immediate gratification over long-term consequences. A man who became belligerent when drunk was a man with anger simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. A man who spent too much money at the bar was a man who could not manage finances, who would drain the family savings chasing temporary comfort. You demonstrated responsibility in small, consistent ways. You arrived on time for every date, every family dinner, every commitment you made. If you said you would pick her up at 6, you were there at 5:55, engine idling, ready to go. If you promised to help her father with a project, you showed up with your tools, ready to work. If you said you would call, you called. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet, steady behaviours that built trust over time. You managed your money carefully, tracking every dollar, ensuring that bills were paid before luxuries were considered. You did not gamble, or if you did, it was small stakes, pocket change, never enough to threaten your financial stability. You did not make impulsive purchases. did not buy things you could not afford just to impress others. You saved first, spent second, and always kept a reserve for emergencies. Responsibility also meant handling conflict maturely. When disagreements arose with co-workers, with friends, with her, you did not lash out or storm off. You stayed calm, listened, worked toward resolution. You apologized when you were wrong and forgave when others were. You did not hold grudges or nurse resentments. You understood that marriage would bring its own conflicts, and you needed to prove you could navigate them without destroying the relationship. You showed up for work every day, even when you were tired, even when you would rather stay home. You took pride in your labor, in the knowledge that you were providing, contributing, earning the respect of your employer and your peers. You did not call in sick unless you were genuinely ill, and even then you felt guilty, as though you were letting people down. Fathers watched how you carried yourself, how you interacted with others, how you responded to stress and disappointment. They watched whether you blamed others for your problems or took responsibility for your mistakes. They watched whether you followed through on commitments or made excuses when things got hard. They watched, and they formed judgments, quiet assessments that determined whether you were the kind of man who could be trusted with their daughter's happiness. When the conversation turned serious, when her father looked you in the eye and asked whether you were ready for marriage, your history of sobriety and responsibility answered for you. You had proven yourself day after day, choice after choice. You had shown that you were steady, reliable, mature. You were not perfect, no one was, but you were consistent, and consistency was what mattered most. The proposal itself was a private moment, intimate and personal, not a public spectacle designed for applause and attention. A man planned carefully, choosing a quiet place where he could speak from the heart without interruption. Some men proposed on evening walks, finding a park bench or a spot beneath the stars. Others proposed at her home, in the living room after her family had gone to bed, or on the porch steps where they had spent so many evenings talking. The setting mattered less than the sincerity. This was not a performance. It was a promise. You chose the moment carefully, waiting for an evening when the timing felt right, when you had her full attention, when the world seemed to quiet around you. You did not want distractions, no crowds, no noise, no sense that this deeply personal question was being asked for anyone's benefit but hers. You wanted her to feel safe, comfortable, able to respond honestly without pressure or performance. Some men proposed on walks, guiding her down a familiar path through the park or along a quiet street lined with trees. The evening air was cool, the sky deepening to purple, the streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one. You walked slowly, your hand in hers, conversation flowing easily until you found the spot you had chosen in your mind. A bench beneath an old oak, a small bridge over a stream, somewhere that felt significant, even if only to you. You stopped walking. She looked at you, curious, sensing something had shifted. You turned to face her, your heart pounding so hard you wondered if she could hear it. You began to speak, your voice steady despite the nerves, telling her how much she meant to you, how your life had changed since you met her, how you could not imagine a future without her in it. Other men proposed at her home, sitting together on the porch after the household had settled into quiet. The crickets chirped in the darkness. A single lamp glowed through the window. You sat close, but not too close, respecting the boundaries that still existed even after months of courtship. You reached for her hand, holding it gently, feeling the warmth of her skin, the pulse at her wrist. You spoke quietly. Your words meant only for her. You told her you'd spoken to her father, that he had given his blessing. You told her you'd prepared for this moment, that you had a job, savings, a plan for your future together. You told her you loved her, simply, directly, with a sincerity that needed no embellishment. Some men proposed indoors, in the living room late at night, the house silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. You sat together on the sofa, the room dim, the day's conversations long finished. This was your moment, the two of you alone, no audience, no pressure. You looked at her, memorizing her face in the soft light, knowing that this moment would stay with you for the rest of your life. You didn't make a grand production of it. You did not hire musicians or arrange elaborate surprises. You simply spoke from the heart, letting your love and your commitment be enough. You told her what she meant to you, what you hoped to build together, what kind of life you wanted to create. You asked her, voice quiet but clear, if she would marry you. The privacy of the moment protected both of you. If she said yes, the joy was yours to share without the gaze of strangers. If she said no, the disappointment was yours to process without public humiliation. The proposal was between you and her, a sacred conversation that required no witnesses, no validation from anyone else. This was how it was done, quietly, personally, with all the weight and tenderness the moment deserved. The moment the ring appeared was the moment everything became real. A man reached into his pocket, pulled out the small velvet box and opened it carefully, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The ring glinted softly in the light, modest but meaningful, a circle of gold or silver holding a small diamond or gemstone he did not drop, to one knee the way movies later suggested. He simply held it out, his voice quiet but firm, and asked the question he had been rehearsing for weeks. Would she marry him? You had carried the ring with you for days, maybe longer, waiting for the right moment. It sat in your jacket pocket, a small weight that you were constantly aware of, checking periodically to make sure it was still there, that you had not somehow lost it. The box was worn smooth from your nervous handling, opened and closed a dozen times in private as you rehearsed what you would say, how you would present it, how you would ask. When the moment arrived, when you had spoken your piece and told her everything in your heart, you reached into your pocket. Your fingers found the box immediately, familiar from so much handling. You pulled it out slowly, watching her face as recognition dawned, as she realized what was happening, what you were about to do. You opened the box carefully, the hinge clicking softly in the quiet evening. The ring sat nestled in its velvet cushion, catching whatever light was available, the small stone glinting like a captured star. You had chosen it carefully, spent months saving for it, and now here it was, offered to the woman you loved, a tangible symbol of everything you hoped to build together. You did not speak immediately. You let her look at it, let the reality settle over both of you. This was not just a piece of jewellery. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration that you wanted to spend the rest of your life with her. The ring was small by modern standards, modest, perhaps even humble, but it represented everything you had, everything you could offer. It was honest, and that honesty made it beautiful. Some women gasped softly when they saw it, their hands flying to their mouths, their eyes filling with tears. Others smiled, wide and bright, their joy so evident it made your own nervousness dissolve. A few reached out immediately, touching the ring gently, as if to confirm it was real, that this moment was actually happening. You held the box steady, giving her time to absorb it all. You watched her face, searching for her reaction, hoping you had chosen well, that the ring was something she would be proud to wear. You had worried about this, lying awake at night wondering if the stone was too small, if the setting was too simple, if she would be disappointed. But looking at her now, seeing the emotion on her face, those worries evaporated. When she finally looked up at you, meeting your eyes, you asked the question. Your voice was quiet, steady, carrying all the weight of what you were proposing. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air between you, simple but profound, containing within them a lifetime of promises, responsibilities, hopes, dreams. You waited. Time seemed to stretch, each second expanding until it felt like an eternity. You could hear your own heartbeat, could feel the cool evening air on your skin, could see the way the light caught in her eyes. Everything else faded away, the world narrowing until it was just the two of you. This moment, this question, this small velvet box holding a ring that represented your future. Her answer, when it came, would change everything. But for now, in this suspended moment, the ring glinted softly in your hand, and you waited, hoping, believing, trusting that the love you shared was strong enough to build a life on. Not every proposal ended in yes. Some women said no, gently but firmly, and a man was expected to accept that answer with dignity. He did not argue, did not plead, did not make her feel guilty for choosing differently. He simply nodded, put the ring away, and walked back into his life with the quiet understanding that some things were not meant to be. Rejection stung, but handling it with grace was a mark of maturity, a sign that he respected her autonomy even in disappointment. You prepared yourself for this possibility, even as you hoped, desperately, that it would not happen. You knew that asking her to marry you was exactly that, a question, not a demand, not an expectation, but a genuine inquiry to which she had every right to say no. You reminded yourself of this as you carried the ring, as you planned the proposal, as you rehearsed your words. She could say no, and if she did, you would have to accept it. The reasons for refusal were varied, and not always about you. Perhaps she was not ready, not because she did not love you, but because marriage felt too large, too permanent, too overwhelming. Perhaps her family had concerns they had not yet voiced, and she needed time to address them. Perhaps she had doubts about her own readiness, about whether she could be the wife she thought you deserved. Perhaps she simply did not love you enough, did not feel the kind of certainty she believed marriage required. If she said no, you felt the rejection like a physical blow, your chest tightening, your breath catching, the world tilting slightly beneath your feet. But you did not let it show, not entirely. You swallowed hard, forced a small smile, and nodded. You closed the ring box carefully, the soft click of the hinge louder than it should have been. You slipped it back into your pocket, your hands steady even though everything inside you was crumbling. You spoke calmly, your voice controlled. "I understand. Thank you for considering it." You did not demand an explanation, did not ask her to justify her decision, didn't try to change her mind. You simply accepted her answer, honouring the fact that she had the right to choose, that her no was as valid as a yes would have been. You stood if you had been sitting. You stepped back, giving her space, letting the moment breathe. You did not linger, did not make the situation more awkward than it already was. You thanked her for her time, for the months of courtship, for the honesty she had shown in answering truthfully. You wished her well, meaning it, even though your heart was breaking. You walked away with your head up, your shoulders straight, your dignity intact. You did not bad-mouth her to your friends, didn't spread rumours, did not paint her as cruel or heartless for refusing you. You kept the details private, deflecting questions with vague answers, protecting her reputation even as you nursed your own wounds. The pain was real and deep. You mourned the future you had imagined, the life you had planned, the family you had hoped to build. You allowed yourself to grieve in private, away from the eyes of others. You sat alone in your apartment, staring at the ring you'd saved so long to buy, wondering what would become of it now, whether you would return it or save it for someone else someday. But you did not let the rejection embitter you. You did not let it twist into anger or resentment. You understood, or tried to. that love was not something you could force or negotiate. It either existed or it did not. She had made her choice, and you respected it, even though it hurt more than you had imagined possible. Time passed. Slowly the sharpness of the rejection dulled. You returned to your routines, your work, your friends, your life. You began to heal, to imagine a future that did not include her, to open yourself to the possibility that someone else might come along, someone who would say yes. And if you saw her again, in town, at church, at a social gathering, you greeted her politely, respectfully, without bitterness or awkwardness. You showed her, and everyone watching, that you were a man of character, a man who could handle disappointment with grace, a man who understood that sometimes no was the right answer, even when it was not the one you wanted to hear. Once she said yes, the engagement became public, but not immediately and not carelessly. First, her parents were told in person, with both of you present. Then came extended family, close friends, co-workers. Some couples placed an announcement in the local newspaper, a small notice that included their names, wedding date, and perhaps a line about how they met. The announcement was formal, respectful, a way of inviting the community to celebrate while maintaining propriety. You did not shout your engagement from the rooftops the moment she said yes, no matter how much you wanted to. You contained your excitement, holding it close, savouring it privately before sharing it with the world. The first people who needed to know were her parents, because the engagement affected them as much as it affected you. Their daughter was leaving their household, beginning a new life, and they deserved to hear it from both of you, together, face to face. You arranged a time to visit, usually the next day or soon after, depending on circumstances. You arrived together, her hand in yours, the ring on her finger now, visible proof of what had happened. Her mother opened the door, took one look at both of you, at the way you were, smiling and knew immediately. Her father appeared behind her, his expression unreadable until you said the words aloud. "We are engaged." Her mother cried, happy tears, pulling her daughter into an embrace, then pulling you in as well. Her father shook your hand, firm and warm, his eyes slightly damp though he would never admit it. They had known this was coming, had given their blessing weeks ago, but hearing it officially, seeing the ring, made it real. Their little girl was getting married. You stayed for coffee, for cake if her mother had any, for a long conversation about plans, timelines, weddings. Her mother asked about dates, about venues, about guest lists. Her father asked about housing, about your job, about whether you felt ready. You answered everything honestly, patiently, understanding that this was their way of processing, of adjusting to the new reality. Next came extended family. You visited aunts and uncles, grandparents if they were still living, siblings who needed to hear the news directly rather than through the grapevine. Each visit followed a similar pattern: excitement, questions, congratulations, advice. Everyone had opinions about weddings, about marriage, about what you should do and when you should do it. You listened politely, nodding, thanking them for their input, even when their suggestions conflicted or felt overwhelming. You told your own family, of course. You brought her with you, introducing her as your fiancé, a word that felt both strange and wonderful in your mouth. Your mother hugged her, welcomed her, immediately began talking about wedding plans. Your father shook your hand, clapped you on the shoulder, told you he was proud. Your siblings teased you, made jokes, but beneath the teasing was genuine happiness, excitement that you were taking this step. You told close friends next, the people who had been with you through the courtship, who had listened to you talk about her for months, who had encouraged you when you were nervous about proposing. They celebrated with you, bought you drinks, toasted your future. Some offered advice, stories from their own marriages, warnings about challenges ahead, but mostly they just expressed joy, happiness, that you had found someone, that you were ready to build a life together. Finally, you placed the announcement in the local newspaper. You went to the newspaper office together, filled out a form with your names, your parents' names, the wedding date, a brief sentence about how you met or where you planned to marry. The announcement would run in the next edition, in the engagement section, alongside other couples taking the same step. It was formal, public, a declaration to the entire community that you were committed, that your intentions were honourable, that your wedding was coming. The announcement brought more congratulations from neighbours, from acquaintances, from people you barely knew who saw your names in print and felt compelled to offer their best wishes. You thanked everyone graciously, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the attention, but also grateful, touched that so many people cared, that your happiness mattered to them. The engagement was no longer private, it was public, official, real, in a way it had not been before. And with that public declaration came responsibility. The responsibility to follow through, to plan the wedding, to prepare for marriage, to live up to the commitment you had made. The engagement was not a free pass. It was a period of preparation, a time to plan the wedding, save money, and prepare for married life. Couples were expected to remain chaste, to continue courting properly, to avoid behaviours that might raise eyebrows or damage reputations. The engagement ring on her finger was a promise, not permission, and a man who respected that boundary showed he could be trusted with the responsibilities that lay ahead. The engagement typically lasted several months, sometimes up to a year, depending on how long it took to save money, plan the wedding, and prepare a home. This was not wasted time. It was essential, a period of transition that allowed both of you to adjust to your new roles, to shift from courting to planning a life together, to begin thinking of yourselves as a unit rather than two individuals. You continued to court her properly, treating her with the same respect and care you'd shown before the engagement. You did not assume that the ring gave you license to relax your standards or behave less honourably. If anything, you were more careful, more conscious of how you acted, because now your behaviour reflected not just on you but on her, on your future marriage, on the commitment you had made publicly. Physical boundaries remained firm. You held hands, you kissed, but you did not go further. This was not prudishness or old-fashioned morality imposed from outside. It was a mutual understanding that marriage was the proper time for physical intimacy, that waiting honoured both the commitment you had made and the values you shared. The temptation was real, especially as the wedding approached and your feelings intensified, but you controlled yourself, showing restraint, proving that you could be trusted. You spent time planning the wedding together, making decisions about the ceremony, the reception, the guest list. These conversations revealed how you handled disagreements, how you compromised, how you prioritized each other's preferences. Some couples discovered during this period that they were not as compatible as they thought, that their visions for the wedding and for life were fundamentally different. Most work through these differences, learning to negotiate, to communicate, to find common ground. You saved money aggressively during the engagement, knowing that the wedding would be expensive and that starting married life with debt was a poor foundation. You cut back on luxuries, on entertainment, on anything that was not essential. You worked overtime when it was available, taking extra shifts, earning every dollar you could. She saved too if she worked or helped in other ways, sewing her own dress, making decorations, finding creative solutions that kept costs down. You prepared a home during this time, if you had not already. You furnished the apartment or house you would move into after the wedding, buying a bed, a table, chairs, dishes, pots and pans, everything you would need to begin your life together. Some items were gifts from family, passed down or given generously. Others you bought second hand, finding good deals, stretching your budget as far as it would go. The goal was not luxury but sufficiency, having enough to start, with the understanding that you would add more over time. You also prepared emotionally, talking about your expectations for marriage, your hopes and fears, your plans for the future. These were not always easy conversations. You discussed finances, how you would handle money, who would manage the budget, how you would make decisions about spending and saving. You discussed children, how many you wanted when you wanted to start a family, how you would raise them. You discussed roles, what you expected from each other, how you would divide responsibilities, how you would support each other through challenges. The engagement period was also a time of public scrutiny. People watched how you behaved, whether you were affectionate but appropriate, whether you seemed happy and compatible, whether you were preparing responsibly. Your reputation during this time was crucial, because any scandal or impropriety would follow you into marriage, casting a shadow over what should be a joyful beginning. You respected the engagement, honoured it, treated it as the serious commitment it was. You did not rush through it, eager to get to the wedding. You used the time wisely, building a foundation, proving to yourself, to her, to both families and to the community that you were ready, that you understood what marriage required, that you could be trusted to follow through on the promises you had made. Wedding planning was not solely the bride's responsibility. A groom was expected to be involved, to contribute financially, to offer opinions on important decisions, and to support his fiancée through the stress of organising a significant event. He met with the minister, helped choose the venue, coordinated with groomsmen, and ensured that his family and hers communicated smoothly. His involvement signalled respect for the marriage, not just the wedding day. You began by meeting with the minister, pastor or priest who would perform the ceremony. This was often one of the first steps, because the church or chapel needed to be reserved, and the religious leader needed to assess whether you were ready for marriage. You sat in his office, answered his questions about your faith, your relationship, your understanding of the vows you would take. Some ministers required premarital counselling, several sessions where you discussed your expectations, your potential challenges, your readiness for the commitment. You attended every session, taking them seriously, appreciating the guidance even when the questions felt intrusive or uncomfortable. You helped choose the venue, visiting churches, community halls, family homes, wherever the ceremony and reception might be held. You walked through the spaces together, imagining how they would look decorated, how many guests they could hold, whether they felt right for the occasion. You offered opinions, not dominating the conversation but participating, showing that you cared about these decisions, that you were invested in creating a meaningful day. You managed your side of the guest list, compiling names, addresses, ensuring that important people were invited, that no one was accidentally overlooked. You coordinated with your groomsmen, choosing friends or brothers who would stand with you, who would support you on the day, who would help with small tasks and large responsibilities. You made sure they knew what was expected, what they needed to wear, when they needed to arrive, how they could help make the day run smoothly. You contributed financially, paying for what was traditionally the groom's responsibility: the marriage license, the officiant's fee, the bride's ring, flowers for the mothers, sometimes the rehearsal dinner. You saved for these expenses, budgeted carefully, made sure you had enough to cover everything without going into debt. If your family offered to help, you accepted graciously, understanding that weddings were community events, that families came together to support the couple starting their life. You also supported her emotionally through the planning process. Weddings were stressful, full of decisions, opinions, expectations, conflicts. Her mother wanted one thing, your mother wanted another, and she was caught in the middle, trying to please everyone, while also creating the day she envisioned. You listened when she vented, reassured her when she worried, helped her make decisions when she felt overwhelmed. You reminded her that the wedding was one day, that what mattered most was the marriage, the life you would build together. You attended fittings, tastings, meetings with florists and musicians, not because you cared deeply about flower arrangements or cake flavours, but because she needed your support, your input, your presence. You offered opinions when asked, deferred to her preferences when it didn't matter to you, compromised when you had different visions. You showed her that you were a partner, that you would face challenges together, that she did not have to carry the burden alone. You also acted as a liaison between families, smoothing over conflicts, facilitating communication, ensuring that both sides felt included and respected. If your mother felt left out of the planning, you talked to your fiancé, found ways to involve her. If her father had concerns about the budget, you addressed them honestly, showing him the numbers, explaining your financial plan. You kept everyone informed, managed expectations, prevented small disagreements from becoming larger rifts. As the wedding approached, your involvement intensified. You confirmed details with vendors, coordinated logistics, made sure everyone knew where to be and when. You picked up your suit, made sure your groomsmen had theirs, ensured that rings were purchased and ready. You attended the rehearsal, walking through the ceremony, learning your cues, practicing your part. Your involvement was not just about logistics. It was about showing respect, showing that you valued the wedding as the beginning of your marriage, that you understood its significance, that you were committed to starting your life together with intention and care. You were not a passive participant waiting for the day to arrive. You were an active partner, working alongside her to create a celebration that honoured both of you, both families, and the commitment you were making to each other. The marriage licence was a legal requirement, but it was also a symbolic step, proof that the state recognised your union as legitimate. You and your fiancé went to the courthouse together, filled out paperwork, paid a small fee, and received a document that allowed you to marry. Some states required blood tests or waiting periods, measures designed to ensure both parties were healthy and serious. The licence was filed away carefully, brought to the ceremony, and signed by witnesses who affirmed that they had seen you pledge your lives to one another. You scheduled a time to go to the courthouse, usually a weekday morning when you could both take time off work. You dressed neatly, not formally, but respectfully, understanding that this was an official errand, a legal transaction that required a certain level of decorum. You drove there together, her hand in yours, both of you nervous in a way that felt different from the nervousness of the proposal. This was bureaucracy, paperwork, the state inserting itself into your personal commitment, but it was necessary, a hoop you had to jump through to make everything official. The courthouse was busy, filled with people handling various legal matters, some happy, some distressed, some simply going through the motions of civic duty. You found the clerk's office, took a number, sat in hard plastic chairs and waited your turn. When your number was called, you approached the counter together, holding hands, facing the clerk who looked tired but not unkind. The clerk handed you forms, thick packets of questions that needed answering. You filled them out carefully, printing your names, addresses, dates of birth, parents' names, occupations. Some questions felt invasive, asking about previous marriages, about health conditions, about details you considered private. But you answered honestly, understanding that lying on a legal document was both unethical and potentially grounds for annulment later. Some states required blood tests, designed to check for communicable diseases, particularly syphilis, which was a public health concern in the 1950s. You went to a clinic, gave blood samples, waited for results. The tests were embarrassing, uncomfortable, a clinical intrusion into what should have been a romantic time. But you understood their purpose, understood that the state had an interest in public health, in ensuring that diseases were not spread through marriage. Other states imposed waiting periods, 3 days, 5 days, a week, between the time you applied for the license and the time you could legally marry. These waiting periods were designed to prevent impulsive marriages, to give couples time to reconsider, to ensure they were serious. You waited, counting down the days, feeling the anticipation build, knowing that each day brought you closer to the wedding. When the license was finally issued, you held it carefully, a single sheet of paper that represented the legal foundation of your marriage. It listed your names, the date you applied, the date the license would expire if not used, the name of the officiant who would perform the ceremony. It felt both mundane and momentous, a bureaucratic document that carried profound significance. You filed it away in a safe place, a folder or envelope where it would not be lost or damaged. Your fiancé reminded you several times to bring it to the wedding, because without it the ceremony could not proceed, the marriage would not be legal. You reassured her each time, promising you would not forget, understanding her nervousness, her need for everything to be perfect. On the wedding day, you brought the license to the ceremony, handed it to the officiant before the service began. After the vows were exchanged, after you were pronounced husband and wife, the officiant signed it, then your witnesses signed it, and finally you and your new wife signed it, making it official. The document was returned to the courthouse, filed in the records, permanent proof that on this day, in this place, you had entered into the legal contract of marriage. The license was not romantic. It was not emotional. It was simply necessary, the legal machinery that undergirded the spiritual and personal commitment you had made. But it mattered because it protected both of you, gave you legal rights and responsibilities, made your marriage recognized not just by your families and your community, but by the state, by the government, by the full weight of the law. Every family had its own customs, its own expectations for how a wedding should unfold. Some families insisted on large gatherings with extended relatives. Others preferred small, intimate ceremonies. Some had specific rituals, blessings, dances, toasts that had been passed down through generations. A man who wanted to marry into a family was expected to embrace these traditions, to participate fully, to show that he valued not just his bride, but the heritage she carried with her. You learned about these traditions early during the engagement, as wedding plans took shape. Her mother explained them, sometimes with a wistful nostalgia, describing how weddings were done in her family, how her own wedding had unfolded, what rituals were important and why. You listened carefully, asked questions, showed genuine interest. These were not burdens to endure, but opportunities to understand the family you were joining, to honour the history and culture that had shaped the woman you loved. Some families had specific ceremonial elements, certain prayers that needed to be recited, certain songs that needed to be sung, certain readings from religious texts, certain blessings offered by elders. You participated in all of them, even if they felt unfamiliar, even if you did not fully understand their significance. You stood when you were supposed to, stand, knelt when you were supposed to kneel, repeated words when asked, bowed your head when appropriate. You showed respect through your actions, your willingness to honour what mattered to them. Other families had reception traditions, specific dances, father-daughter dances, mother-son dances, group dances where everyone participated, specific toasts in a particular order with specific people given the honour of speaking, specific foods, dishes that had been served at family weddings for generations, recipes passed down, flavours that carried memory and meaning. You ate everything offered, praised the cooking, thanked the cooks personally, understanding that food was love, that these dishes represented care and connection. Some families had rituals around the ceremony itself. Walking the bride down the aisle was not universal. Some families had both parents walk her. Some had her walk alone. Some had elaborate processions involving entire extended families. You followed their lead, took your place where you were told, moved when directed, trusting that they knew how this should unfold, that their way had meaning and history behind it. You also navigated the blending of two families' traditions, yours and hers, finding ways to honour both without creating conflict or confusion. If your family always had a specific toast at weddings, you made sure it was included. If her family always released doves or lit candles or performed a unity ritual, you embraced it, participated, made it part of your wedding. You compromised when traditions conflicted, finding creative solutions, ways to honour both heritages without diminishing either. You showed respect by learning the names of extended family members, the aunts and uncles and cousins who would attend the wedding, who would become part of your life. You greeted them warmly, remembered details they had shared in previous conversations, showed that you cared about them as individuals, not just as obligations to endure. You understood that marrying her meant marrying into this entire network of relationships, that her family was now your family, that their traditions were now, in part, your traditions. You also understood that honouring traditions did not mean blindly following every expectation. If something felt deeply wrong, if a tradition conflicted with your values or hers, you discussed it openly, respectfully, finding ways to adapt or modify without causing offence. Most families were willing to compromise, to adjust traditions for the modern world, as long as the spirit of the tradition, the love and respect it represented, remained intact. On the wedding day, you participated fully in every ritual, every tradition, every custom her family held dear. You did not roll your eyes or check your watch or treat any of it as pointless ceremony. You understood that these traditions connected past to present, that they honoured ancestors who had stood where you now stood, that they wove your marriage into a larger story, a family narrative that stretched back generations and would continue forward through your children and grandchildren. You honoured her family's traditions because you honoured her, because you understood that she was shaped by these customs, that they were part of who she was, that embracing them was embracing her fully, completely, without reservation. The wedding band was simpler than the engagement ring, but no less important. It was a plain circle of gold or silver, unadorned and timeless, a symbol of continuity and commitment. Some men chose matching bands, so that both husband and wife wore identical rings, a visual reminder that they were now partners, equals in the marriage. The band was presented during the ceremony, slipped onto her finger with words spoken before God, family and community. You purchased the wedding band weeks before the ceremony, visiting the same jeweller who had sold you the engagement ring. He recognized you immediately, smiled, asked how the engagement was going, congratulated you on the upcoming wedding. He brought out a tray of wedding bands, plain circles in varying widths and metals, each one gleaming softly under the shop lights. You examined them carefully, lifting each one, feeling its weight, imagining it on her finger. Some were yellow gold, warm and traditional. Others were white gold or platinum, cooler in tone, more modern. The jeweller explained the differences, the durability of each metal, the way they would wear over time, how they would need to be cared for. You listened, asked questions, made your decision based on what felt right, what seemed like something she could wear every day for the rest of her life without tiring of it. You also chose your own band, often matching hers, a symbol of equality and partnership. The idea that both spouses wore wedding rings was relatively new in the 1950s, gaining popularity after World War II when soldiers wore rings as reminders of home, of the women waiting for them. You liked the symmetry of it, the idea that both of you would carry this visible mark of your marriage, that anyone who looked at your hands would know you were committed, claimed, no longer available. The bands were sized carefully, measured to fit perfectly, neither too tight nor too loose. The jeweler used a ring sizer, sliding different sizes onto your fingers until he found the right one, then did the same for her when she accompanied you on a return visit. Some couples had their bands engraved, initials and dates etched on the inside, hidden messages that only the two of you would ever see. You considered it, discussed it, decided whether you wanted that extra layer of personalization or preferred the simplicity of an unmarked band. You paid for the bands, watching as the jeweler wrapped them carefully, placing each in its own small box. He handed them to you with a smile, wished you luck, told you to come back if you ever needed them cleaned or resized. You left the shop with the boxes in your pocket, feeling their weight, knowing that in a few weeks you would slip one of these rings onto her finger and speak the words that would bind you together for life. The bands were kept safe until the wedding day, often entrusted to the best man, who carried them in his pocket during the ceremony, ready to hand them over at the appropriate moment. You checked multiple times to make sure he had them, worried irrationally that they might be lost or forgotten, that the ceremony would reach that critical moment and the rings would not be there. During the ceremony, when the officiant asked for the rings, your best man stepped forward, placed them in the officiant's hand or on a small pillow if the ceremony was formal. The officiant blessed them, spoke words about their symbolism, about the unbroken circle representing eternal love, about the precious metal representing the value of the commitment being made. Then came the moment. You took her ring, held it gently and slipped it onto her finger, sliding it over her knuckle until it rested beside the engagement ring. You spoke the words, your voice steady despite the emotion swelling in your chest. With this ring, I thee wed. Simple words, ancient words, words that carried the weight of history and tradition and personal commitment all at once. She did the same for you, taking your ring, her hands trembling slightly, slipping it onto your finger. You felt the metal settle into place, cool at first, then warming against your skin. You looked down at it, this plain circle of gold, and felt something shift inside you. You were married now. This ring was proof, a symbol you would wear every day, a reminder of the promises you had just made. The ring stayed on your fingers from that moment forward, rarely removed, becoming part of you. You felt naked without yours, on the rare occasions when you took it off to do heavy work or repairs. You twisted it absently when you were nervous or thinking, feeling its smooth surface, drawing comfort from its presence. It was a talisman, a touchstone, a physical manifestation of the invisible bond you shared. Years later, the ring would show signs of wear, scratches and dings accumulated over decades of life lived together. But those imperfections only made it more valuable, more meaningful, a record of your marriage written in gold, a testament to the commitment you made on that day when you first slipped it on and promised to love her forever. The vows were not casual promises. They were sacred commitments, spoken aloud in front of everyone who mattered, binding you to this woman for the rest of your life. You stood at the altar, your voice steady despite your nerves, and repeated the words the minister spoke. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. These were not empty phrases. They were the foundation of everything that came next. You had heard these vows before, at other weddings, at your friends' ceremonies, at family members' marriages. You had listened as other men spoke them, their voices confident or trembling, their faces serious or smiling. You had witnessed the moment when words became bonds, when promises spoken aloud transformed two individuals into a married couple. But hearing them was different from speaking them. Standing at the altar, facing the woman you loved, preparing to make these promises yourself, the weight of the words became real in a way you had not fully anticipated. the minister spoke first, his voice carrying through the church, reaching every person gathered in the pews. He explained the significance of the vows, reminded everyone present that marriage was not to be entered into lightly, that the promises being made were sacred and binding. He looked at you, met your eyes, and you nodded, understanding, ready. Then he began the vows, speaking each line slowly, clearly, pausing after each phrase so you could repeat it. You focused on the words, on their meaning, refusing to simply recite them by rote, to have and to hold. You thought about what that meant, about holding her when she cried, about having her beside you through all the years ahead, from this day forward. Not just today, not just when things were easy, but from this moment until the end of your life. Your voice was steady as you repeated each line, loud enough for everyone to hear, clear enough that there could be no doubt about your commitment. For better or for worse. You knew there would be worse, that life would bring challenges, hardships, losses. You were promising to stay through all of it, to not abandon her when things got difficult, to honour your commitment even when it would be easier to walk away, for richer or for poorer. You thought about the modest savings you had, the apartment you would live in, the uncertain future of your finances. You were promising that money would not determine your love, that you would stay with her whether you prospered or struggled, whether you achieved wealth or lived paycheck to paycheck, in sickness and in health. This was perhaps the most sobering part of the vows, the acknowledgement that bodies failed, that illness came, that there would be times when one of you needed care, needed patience, needed the other to be strong when strength felt impossible. You were promising to be there, to nurse her through sickness, to support her through weakness, to love her even when her body betrayed her. Until death do us part. The finality of these words settled over you like a cloak. This was not a temporary arrangement. This was not something you could walk away from when it stopped being fun or easy. This was forever, or as close to forever as human life allowed. You were binding yourself to her for the rest of your days, and that binding was both terrifying and beautiful. She spoke her vows next, repeating the same words, making the same promises. You watched her face as she spoke, saw the emotion in her eyes, the slight trembling of her lips, the way she had to pause to steady her voice. She meant every word just as you did, and knowing that hearing her commitment spoken aloud made your own promises feel even more significant. When the vows were finished, when both of you had spoken, the minister pronounced you husband and wife. The words hung in the air for a moment, transforming everything. You were no longer engaged. You were no longer courting. You were married, bound together by the promises you had just made, by the vows you'd spoken in front of God and family and community. You would remember those vows for the rest of your life, return to them in difficult moments, remind yourself of what you had promised. They were not just words spoken on a single day. They were the framework of your marriage, the principles that would guide you through decades of life together, the foundation on which everything else would be built. The wedding reception was a time for joy, but also for restraint. You danced with your bride, greeted guests, thanked everyone for coming, and ensured that the celebration remained dignified. Drinking was acceptable, but drunkenness was not. Speeches were heartfelt but brief. The focus was on beginning your marriage, not on throwing the wildest party anyone had ever seen. You left the reception early, not because you were tired, but because your life together was beginning, and that was more important than any party. The reception hall was decorated simply but beautifully. White streamers and flowers, tables covered in clean linens, a small band or record player providing music. Guests arrived, dressed in their Sunday best, carrying gifts wrapped in brown paper and ribbon. They found their seats, chatted with neighbours, waited for you and your new wife to make your entrance. When you walked in together, announced as husband and wife for the first time, everyone stood and applauded. The sound washed over you, warm and affirming, a communal expression of joy and support. You smiled, waved, felt your wife's hand tighten in yours, both of you slightly overwhelmed by the attention, but grateful for it. You moved through the reception systematically, visiting each table, thanking guests personally for coming, for their gifts, for their support. You shook hands with the men, kissed the cheeks of elderly aunts, accepted congratulations with humility and grace. Some guests offered advice, some shared stories from their own marriages, some simply smiled and told you they were happy for you. You listened to all of it, filed it away, appreciated the wisdom even when it felt contradictory or outdated. The meal was served, simple but plentiful, roast chicken or ham, potatoes, vegetables, rolls, cake for dessert. You sat at the head table with your wife, your wedding party flanking you, and tried to eat despite the nerves and excitement that made your stomach uncertain. You managed a few bites, drank some water, focused on the moment, on the people around you, on the reality that you were married now, that this celebration was marking the beginning of your life together. Toast came next, glasses raised, words spoken. Your best man went first, sharing stories from your friendship, making jokes that walk the line between funny and embarrassing, but never crossed it. He spoke about your character, about how he had watched you prepare for this day, about how he knew you would be a good husband. He raised his glass, wished you happiness, and everyone drank. Her father stood next, his voice thick with emotion. He spoke about his daughter, about watching her grow up, about the bittersweet reality of giving her away. He looked at you, met your eyes, and said he was trusting you with his most precious treasure, that he believed you would honour that trust. You nodded, swallowed hard, felt the weight of his words settle over you. You danced with your wife, a slow waltz or foxtrot, the band playing something romantic and familiar. You held her close, moved awkwardly because you had never been a natural dancer, but she did not seem to mind. She smiled up at you, her face radiant, and for a moment the entire room faded away. It was just the two of you, swaying together, beginning this new chapter. You danced with her mother next, a tradition, a courtesy, a way of honouring the woman who had raised your wife. She thanked you for making her daughter happy, told you she was glad you were joining their family. You thanked her for welcoming you, for raising such an incredible woman, for trusting you with her care. Drinks were available, beer and wine and perhaps whiskey for the men who wanted something stronger. You had one drink, maybe two, but you did not overindulge. You stayed clear-headed, present, aware that this day was too important to lose to alcohol. You watched other guests drink, some more than they should, loosening their ties, laughing too loudly, but you kept your distance from that edge, determined to remember every moment. As the evening wore on, as the cake was cut and served, as the music continued and guests danced and celebrated, you began to think about leaving. Not because the party was not enjoyable, but because you were ready to begin your life, to be alone with your wife, to step into the future you had planned and prepared for. You said your goodbyes, thanking your parents, her parents, your friends, everyone who had made the day possible. You changed out of your wedding clothes into travelling clothes, something comfortable for the drive to wherever you would spend your first night as a married couple. Your wife changed too, emerging in a simple dress, her hair still styled but her face showing the exhaustion and happiness of the long day. You walked out together through a shower of rice thrown by guests, laughing as the grains bounced off your shoulders. You climbed into your car, waved one last time and drove away, the reception fading behind you, your marriage stretching ahead. After the wedding came the reality of married life, and that reality required a home. It didn't need to be large or luxurious, but it needed to be yours, a place where you and your wife could begin building a life together. You furnished it modestly, a bed, a table, a few chairs, enough to get started. Over time, you added more: curtains, rugs, dishes, small comforts that turned a house into a home. But in those early days, all that mattered was that you had created a space where she felt safe, valued, and loved. The home you provided was likely an apartment, 2 or 3 rooms in a building shared with other young couples, all of you starting out, all of you making do with limited space and limited budgets. The apartment was on the 2nd or 3rd floor, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked underfoot. The walls were thin enough that you could hear neighbours talking, hear babies crying, hear the rhythm of other people's lives unfolding parallel to your own. You had prepared the apartment before the wedding, spending weekends painting walls, scrubbing floors, making sure everything was clean and ready. You chose paint colours together, nothing too bold, soft colours that made the small rooms feel larger, brighter. You painted carefully, taping edges, covering floors with old newspapers, working until your arms ached and paint dotted your clothes and hair. The furniture was mostly second-hand, purchased from relatives who were upgrading or from shops that sold estate goods. The bed was solid. The mattress new, even if the frame was not. You made it up together, tucking in fresh sheets, arranging pillows, both of you aware that this bed would be where your married life truly began, where intimacy would unfold, where children might eventually be conceived. The kitchen table was small, big enough for 2, scarred from years of use by previous owners, but sturdy and functional. You set it near the window where morning light would fall across it, where you could sit together over coffee and breakfast, where you would share meals and conversations for years to come. The chairs didn't match, one from your family, one from hers, a physical representation of 2 lives coming together. You bought dishes, mismatched sets from the 5 and dime, plates and bowls and cups that were practical rather than beautiful. You would replace them eventually, upgrade to matching sets when money allowed, but for now they served their purpose. You filled the kitchen with basics: a pot, a pan, a few utensils, enough to cook simple meals, to feed yourselves without relying on anyone else. The apartment had 1 closet, small and shallow, barely enough for both of your clothes. You shared the space, your work clothes on one side, her dresses on the other, learning to negotiate, to make room, to share not just physical space, but the invisible space of habit and routine. You learned where she liked to keep things, adjusted your own habits to accommodate hers, began the long process of blending 2 separate lives into one shared existence. You hung curtains, fabric she'd sewn or purchased, simple panels that provided privacy and softened the hard edges of the windows. You placed a rug on the living room floor, something to warm the space, to muffle footsteps, to make the apartment feel more like home and less like a temporary stopping place. The home was humble, modest by any standard, but it was yours. You had worked for it, saved for it, prepared it with your own hands. Every piece of furniture, every dish, every curtain represented effort and intention. This was not something given to you. This was something you had earned, had created, had provided for the woman you loved. In the evenings after work, you came home to this space, climbed the creaking stairs, unlocked the door and found her there waiting, your wife, your home. The apartment was small and the furniture was old and the walls were thin, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that it was a beginning, a foundation, the first home of your married life, the place where you would learn to be a husband, where she would learn to be a wife, where you would build a life together one day, one meal, one conversation at a time. The wedding was one day. The marriage was everything that came after. You woke up beside your wife every morning, faced challenges together, built a life brick by brick. You worked to provide, listened when she needed to talk, held her when she cried, celebrated her victories as your own. You kept your promises, honoured your vows, and proved through your actions that you were the man she believed you to be when she said yes. The rules that governed your path to marriage were just the beginning. The real test was living up to them every single day. Marriage was not a destination. It was a journey, one that required daily effort, daily choice, daily commitment. The excitement of the wedding faded. The novelty of living together wore off. What remained was the reality of two imperfect people learning to share a life, learning to navigate disagreements, learning to support each other through the mundane and the monumental. You woke each morning and chose, consciously or unconsciously, to honour your commitment. You got out of bed even when you were tired, went to work even when you did not want to, came home even when the day had been long and difficult. You provided not because it was easy, but because it was what you had promised to do, what she depended on you to do, what marriage required. You learned her rhythms, her moods, her needs. You learned when she needed space and when she needed closeness, when she needed advice and when she just needed someone to listen. You learned to read the subtle signs, the slight tension in her voice, the way she moved through the apartment when something was bothering her. You learned to ask the right questions, to offer comfort without trying to fix everything, to simply be present in her struggles. There were disagreements, of course, moments when you wanted different things, when your priorities clashed, when old habits collided with new realities. You learned to argue without wounding, to disagree without disrespecting, to find compromise without keeping score. You learned that being right mattered less than being kind, that winning an argument often meant losing something more important. You held her when she cried, offering your strength when hers faltered. Sometimes the tears were about something specific, a disappointment, a loss, a fear. Other times they came from nowhere, from the overwhelming weight of life, from hormones or exhaustion, or simply the need to release emotion. You did not always understand, did not always know what to say, but you held her anyway, let her dampen your shirt with her tears, offered the comfort of your presence. Even when words failed, you celebrated her victories big and small. When she mastered a new recipe, you praised the meal. When she made a friend, you welcomed that friend into your home. When she accomplished something difficult, you acknowledged her effort, her success, made her feel seen and valued. You understood that her happiness contributed to yours, that you were a team, that her victories were your victories too. You worked, day after day, year after year, providing for the household, carrying the financial burden so she could focus on the home, on the children when they came, on creating the stable domestic life you had promised her. The work was often difficult, sometimes monotonous, occasionally frustrating. But you did it without complaint, or at least without excessive complaint, because you understood that this was your role, your contribution to the partnership. You kept your promises, the big ones spoken at the altar and the small ones spoken in daily conversation. If you said you would be home by 6, you were home by 6. If you said you would fix the leaky faucet, you fixed it. If you said you would take her to visit her parents, you took her. Your word meant something, and you protected its value by honouring it consistently. You honoured your vows, returning to them in difficult moments, reminding yourself what you had promised, for better or for worse. When money was tight, when illness came, when life felt overwhelming, you remembered that you had known it would not always be easy, that you had promised to stay anyway. The vows were not just words spoken on a single day. They were a covenant, a framework, a compass that guided you through the complexities of married life. You proved through your actions that you were the man she believed you to be. Not perfect, not without flaws, but committed, faithful, present, working daily to be better, to love more fully, to honour the trust she had placed in you when she agreed to marry you, the rules that had governed your path to marriage, seeking permission, demonstrating character, providing stability, all of those were just preparation. They had tested whether you were ready to begin. Now came the real test, the test that lasted not for months but for decades, the test of showing up every single day and choosing again and again to love her, to honour her, to build a life with her. That was the commitment, not the wedding day, beautiful as it was, not the proposal, meaningful as it was, but the daily choice, the daily effort, the daily renewal of the promises you made. That was marriage. That was what it meant to follow the rules, not just to reach the altar, but to honour the commitment every day after. Marriage did not just join two people, it joined two families, complete with their expectations, their traditions, their opinions about how you should live your life. You learned quickly that keeping peace with in-laws required patience, tact, and the ability to smile politely while being told how to raise children who did not exist yet. Sunday dinners became diplomatic missions. Holiday visits required strategic planning. And somewhere between respecting boundaries and honouring family ties, you found a balance that kept everyone mostly happy, or at least mostly quiet. Your mother-in-law had opinions, many opinions, about how you kept house, though the house was not hers, about how you spent money, though the money was not hers either, about whether you were working hard enough, saving enough, planning wisely enough for the future. She meant well, or at least you told yourself she meant well, because the alternative was acknowledging that she simply enjoyed having authority over your choices. You learned to listen without always obeying, to nod thoughtfully without committing to action. When she suggested you needed a larger apartment, you agreed it would be nice someday, without mentioning that someday was not today and possibly not next year either. When she criticised your wife's cooking, you defended quietly, praising the meal, redirecting the conversation before it could become an argument. You protected your wife from the sharper criticisms, absorbed them yourself, let them roll off because keeping peace was more important than being right. Your father-in-law watched you differently, assessing whether you were living up to the promises you had made. He noticed when you came home late from work, when you looked tired, when money seemed tight. He did not say much, but you felt his scrutiny, understood that he was still evaluating, still determining whether he had made the right decision in giving his blessing. You worked harder, partly to prove yourself to him, to show that his trust had not been misplaced. Your own parents had opinions too about your wife, about how she kept house, about whether she was appreciating you properly. Your mother worried you were working too hard, not eating enough, not visiting enough. Your father offered unsolicited advice about finances, about career moves, about decisions you'd already made. You navigated both sides, defending your wife to your parents just as you defended yourself to hers, creating a united front even when you privately agreed with some of the criticisms. Holiday visits were particularly challenging. Christmas meant negotiating whose family you visited first, how long you stayed, whether you could possibly squeeze in both dinners without offending anyone. Thanksgiving required similar diplomacy. You learned to alternate years, to split days, to show up bearing gifts and compliments, to praise the meal regardless of whether it was actually good, to express gratitude for hospitality even when you would rather have been home. You set boundaries, carefully, gently, but firmly. When in-laws offered to visit without asking first, you suggested specific dates that worked better. When advice became intrusive, you thanked them politely and explained that you and your wife were handling it. When expectations felt unreasonable, you negotiated, compromised, found middle ground that respected their feelings without sacrificing your autonomy. You learned that marriage required protecting your household, creating a space where you and your wife made decisions together without undue interference. You honoured both families, visited regularly, maintained relationships, but you also established that your marriage came first, that your home was your own, that while you valued their input, the final decisions were yours to make. The diplomacy was exhausting sometimes, the constant balancing, the careful word choices, the strategic visits. But it was necessary, part of the cost of joining two families, part of the reality of marriage in an era when family ties were strong and expectations were high. You navigated it as best you could, keeping peace, maintaining relationships, building a life that honoured your commitments to both your wife and the families that had shaped you both. Money was tight in the early years of marriage, and sometimes it stayed tight for decades. The economy shifted, layoffs happened, unexpected expenses arrived without warning. You learned to stretch every dollar to make do with less, to find creative solutions when the bank account dwindled to nothing. Your wife mended clothes instead of buying new ones. You took on extra work, side jobs, anything that brought in a few more dollars. And through it all, you held the household together, refusing to let financial pressure crack the foundation you'd built. The first real financial crisis came without warning, the way they always did. Your hours were cut at work, or you lost your job entirely, or a major expense, medical bills, car repairs, something unavoidable, drained your savings in a single devastating blow. You sat at the kitchen table, bills spread in front of you, doing math that refused to work out no matter how many times you tried. Your wife stood behind you, her hand on your shoulder, both of you staring at numbers that did not add up to survival. You did not panic, or at least you did not let her see you panic. You made a plan. You cut expenses immediately, eliminating anything that was not essential. No more movies, no more dinners out, not that you'd been eating out much anyway. You cancelled subscriptions, reduced groceries to bare necessities, found ways to save pennies that accumulated into dollars. You looked for additional work, asking everyone you knew if they had odd jobs available. You mowed lawns, painted houses, delivered newspapers before dawn, anything that paid. You worked 12, 14, 16-hour days, coming home exhausted, hands blistered, body aching, but carrying money that would keep food on the table and the rent paid. Your wife contributed however she could. She took in sewing, mending neighbours' clothes for small fees. She babysat children from the building, watching them in your apartment while their mothers worked. She stretched meals impossibly far, making soup from bones, bread from flour and water, feeding you both on almost nothing. She never complained, never blamed you for the hardship, never suggested that maybe she had married the wrong man. You sold things when you had to, items you'd saved for or received as gifts. The radio you had been so proud of, the watch your father gave you, small luxuries that could be converted into rent money or grocery money or whatever crisis needed addressing that week. Each sale hurt, but survival mattered more than sentiment. You borrowed money as a last resort, asking family or friends, promising to repay as soon as possible, tracking every penny you owed. The debt weighed on you, the knowledge that you had failed to provide adequately, that you needed help. But you accepted it, because refusing would have meant worse consequences, eviction or hunger or utility shut off. You kept your marriage intact through the hardship. You did not drink away your frustration or disappear into resentment. You did not blame her for expenses or make her feel guilty for needing things. You faced the crisis together, making decisions jointly, supporting each other through the fear and uncertainty. Some nights you lay awake calculating, running numbers in your head, trying to find solutions that did not exist. She lay awake beside you, both of you pretending to sleep, both of you worrying quietly in the darkness. But in the morning you got up, went to work, kept trying, kept pushing forward because giving up was not an option. Slowly, gradually, things improved. You found better work, or your hours increased, or the crisis passed. You rebuilt your savings penny by penny. You repaid debts, restoring your reputation, proving you were a man who honoured his obligations. You replaced some of what you had sold, though some things were gone forever, sacrificed to survival. The hardship taught you what you were made of, what your marriage was made of. It stripped away everything except the essential truth that you were partners, that you would face challenges together, that money might control many things, but it would not control whether you stayed committed to each other. You emerged from the crisis stronger, wiser, more careful with money, but also more confident that whatever came next, you could handle it together. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blanket, take a moment to think about the young men who walked this path before us, who saved for modest rings, who rehearsed their proposals until the words felt right, who stood nervously before fathers and asked for blessings they were not sure they would receive. They were not heroes in the cinematic sense. They were just men trying to do right by the women they loved, following rules that felt both burdensome and necessary, building lives one careful decision at a time. They woke early and worked hard and came home tired. They provided not because it was glamorous, but because it was expected, because their word mattered, because marriage was a commitment they honoured through decades of ordinary days. They were not perfect. They made mistakes, lost their tempers, struggled with doubt and fear and inadequacy. But they showed up. They stayed. They kept their promises when keeping them was difficult, and maybe that is something worth remembering now, in an era when commitment feels more fluid, when the rules have loosened or disappeared entirely. Not that we should return to every expectation of the 1950s, but perhaps that we could reclaim some of the intentionality, the seriousness, the understanding that marriage was not just about feelings, but about choices made daily. Vows honoured through better and worse. Partnerships built on something sturdier than romance alone. So as your breathing slows and your eyes grow heavy, carry this forward. The knowledge that ordinary commitment sustained over time is its own kind of extraordinary. That showing up matters, that keeping your word matters, that love is not just a feeling but a decision you make, again and again, until the years accumulate into a life well lived. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a young man with a ring in his pocket, gathering his courage, preparing to promise forever. And that, in its own quiet way, is beautiful. Good night.